For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 663 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 663, a bill to amend the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 663 as amended, the bill now under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 663, the Native American Child Protection Act, introduced by Congressman Gallego from Arizona, would amend the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act to reauthorize 3 programs administered by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Interior. These programs include the Indian Child Abuse Treatment Grant Program, the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Program, and the Indian Child Resource and Family Service Centers, which would be renamed the National Indian Child Resource and Family Service Center under this legislation. These programs are intended to prevent cases within Indian communities where child abuse, neglect, family violence, and trauma may occur, and to provide treatment for victims of Indian child sexual abuse. H.R. 663 also makes several technical changes to the underlying statute and requires agency reports on grant awards and performance. The Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act was introduced in 1989 by the late Arizona Senator John McCain in response to widespread reports that Native children were being physically and sexually abused, that these incidences were going underreported, and that there needed to be supports in place to ensure the Bureau of Indian Affairs could handle the situation at the time. The Act created the programs H.R. 663 would reauthorize, and it included provisions to provide tribes with technical assistance training and other resources related to the investigation and treatment of the cases of family violence, abuse, and neglect. The authorization for these programs expired in 1997. H.R. 663 would reauthorize these programs and make improvements to the program's operations and service delivery. Advocates cite the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act as the only federal statute that sets aside funding for tribal governments dedicated to child abuse prevention and victim treatment funding for tribal governments. I appreciate the gentleman from Arizona for bringing attention to this important issue, as abuse, neglect, and violence have no place in any community, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 663, the Native American Child Protection Act. American Indian and Alaska Native children have the highest rate of child abuse in the United States, at a rate of 15 cases for every 1,000 children. This can have devastating impacts on a child's cognitive, emotional, and neurological development, and can last them well into adulthood and even their entire life. On top of this crisis, the Supreme Court recently heard a case attempting to gut the Indian Child Welfare Act, which protects the rights of Native children and families. That's why passing the Native American Child Protection Act today is so timely. My bipartisan bill reauthorizes and revises programs that give tribes the tools to treat, prevent, investigate, and prosecute child abuse and family violence involving Native American children. The programs in this bill were originally led by another Arizonan back in 1990 through John McCain's Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act. That bill was part of a promise to answer for the tragic abuse that happened at federally run Native American boarding schools. But the programs have never been fully funded, were never authorized, and eventually expired. This is a failure by the federal government and the continuation of centuries of broken promises. By passing H.R. 663, we will take a step to right this wrong. We will create a National Indian Child Resource and Family Services Center to help tribes and urban Indian organizations with training and program development. We will develop new intergovernmental agreements between tribes and states to prevent, investigate, treat, and prosecute family violence. And we will encourage culturally appropriate treatments and services for children that have been impacted. In a place where we see a lot of partisan bickering, it is heartening to see so much bipartisan support around tribal issues, including my Republican counterpart and co-lead on this bill, Representative Newhouse. I also want to thank Natural Resources Committee Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Raul Grijalva, as well as Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee Chairman Hagman and Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez for their support. The Native American Child Protection Act is another chance for us to work together and fulfill our promise to help this vulnerable population. I urge my colleagues to support final passage of H.R. 663, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time and am prepared to close, and I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation does the critical work of Congress to update and reauthorize programs. This work is especially important when the programs in question help protect children and support tribes in caring for their tribal members. I urge the adoption of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 663 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.